the cold seeped into Lawrence Kane's bones. It was a familiar ache, one that had nothing to do with the crisp Idaho air. This phantom chill, born of fire and dust and the screams that still echoed in the quieter chambers of his mind, held him in its grip. 5 years earlier, the inferno of a collapsing structure in a forgotten Middle Eastern village had claimed his team. Lawrence alone survived, pulled from the rubble by hands that blurred at the edges of his memory. He left the United States Army Rangers soon after, finding a balm in the silence of the woods, where the rustle of leaves replaced the roar of combat. His new life as a contractor for the Federal Wildlife Service settled into a monotonous, methodical rhythm of quiet assignments. He called them anomalous animal eliminations. The agency itself functioned as a half-mythical entity. Its operations shrouded in such secrecy, Lawrence never questioned them. His contract was simple: receive a location, identify the target, confirm liquidation, and maintain absolute silence. No debriefs, no follow-ups, no records. This system, devoid of human interaction or emotional complexity, suited him perfectly. It kept the haunting memories at bay. The new order arrived on his encrypted terminal, a series of codes that bypassed his usual protocols. It was not the urgency that caught his attention. His assignments were always urgent, but the language: aggressive animal unknown species. That phrase, so deliberately vague, raised the hairs on his neck. His usual targets were clear: mutated bears, wolves with abnormal aggression, things explained away by environmental contaminants or bizarre biological anomalies. Unknown species implied something entirely different. It implied a void where knowledge should have existed. He pulled up the coordinates: Salmon Chalice Sector, deep in the Clearwater National Forest. This vast, untamed expanse of wild nature, known for its rugged terrain and minimal human presence, was a perfect place for things to disappear. Lawrence began his preparations. His movements were automatic, honed by decades of military precision and years of solitary work. His rifle, a custom-built weapon, felt like an extension of his arm. He checked his thermal optics, his suppressed rounds, the array of tracking devices and traps. He packed meals, ready to eat, water filters, and medical supplies with an almost ritualistic efficiency. Every item had a purpose, every action a reason. Yet, an unfamiliar unease gnawed at the edges of his practiced calm. A premonition, cold and sharp, told him this assignment was unlike any other. The drive north was long. Paved roads slowly gave way to gravel, then to little more than overgrown tracks. The further he drove, the more the world receded. His satellite phone flickered, then died. The radio, usually a constant hum of local chatter, produced only static. The Federal Wildlife Service message had contained a brief, almost offhand warning about a restricted zone and anticipated communication issues. Lawrence had dismissed it as standard protocol for classified operations. Now, the dead silence in his truck's cabin felt like a physical weight, pressing down on him, severing him from the known world. It was a meticulously crafted isolation. The official cover story for this sudden closure of a vast forest sector was a rabies outbreak among local wildlife. Lawrence snorted. He had dealt with rabies. Rabid animals were predictable, feral, frenzied, but ultimately just animals. They did not require this level of secrecy, this total communications blackout, this methodical expulsion of every park ranger and civilian. No, this was not rabies. This was something far more sinister, something the agency considered too dangerous, too impossible to acknowledge openly. He wondered with a professional detachment that was chilling, if even they truly understood what they dealt with. He parked his truck deep within the sector's designated perimeter, hidden under a dense canopy of ancient pines. The forest here was different, eerily quiet. There was no bird song, no distant chitter of squirrels, no rustle of deer through the underbrush. The usual symphony of the wilderness was absent, replaced by a profound, heavy silence that felt less like peace and more like a void. Lawrence stepped out, his boots crunching on dry needles, the only sound for miles. The air itself felt heavy, thick with an unspoken dread. He saw the first signs soon enough. A park ranger's all-terrain vehicle overturned and half buried in a tangle of ferns, its paint faded, its tires flat. It had been there for weeks, months. Nearby, a torn piece of park ranger uniform snagged on a thorn bush. No blood, just the fabric. Further on, he found the remains of an elk, its carcass picked clean, but the bones scattered in an unnatural pattern, almost deliberately arranged. The skull, intact, had a gaping, jagged hole where a predator's bite should have been, but the edges were too sharp, too precise to be an animal's work. The hairs on Lawrence's neck rose again, this time with a distinct, unsettling prickle of fear. This was not a sick animal. This was something else. Something that defied the rules of nature he had spent a lifetime observing. And he was now alone with it, cut off from the world in a forest that no longer sang. The oppressive silence of the salmon chalice sector clung to Lawrence like a shroud. He moved with practiced precision, setting up his base camp at a small clearing near a trickling creek. The air here held a penetrating chill, despite the clear sky, a pervasive cold that emanated not from the temperature, but from the very ground itself. He methodically unpacked his gear, each item finding its pre-assigned place. First, the compact tent, camouflaged against the pines. Then the tripwires, designed to alert him to any movement larger than a squirrel. He rigged directional microphones, tiny acoustic sensors that picked up the faintest rustle or distant snap of a twig, feeding the audio directly to a small receiver clipped to his belt. Finally, he deployed a series of non-lethal deterrents, pressure plates linked to high-frequency emitters, designed to disorient and warn off large predators. This was not just a camp. It was a fortress, a carefully constructed bubble of control in a world that felt increasingly out of his grasp. Once his perimeter was secure, Lawrence began his first sweep of the immediate area. He moved silently, a shadow among shadows, his rifle held ready. The ground was soft with centuries of pine needles and decaying leaves, making tracking difficult, but Lawrence's eyes were trained to find what others missed. His objective: confirm the presence of human casualties and analyze the patterns of attack. He found the first park ranger almost a mile from his camp, half buried under a fallen log. The body was contorted, limbs at unnatural angles, the uniform torn but not shredded. Lacerations, deep and precise, marked the neck and chest, but strikingly, very little blood appeared. Something had drained the life from him rather than torn it away. The most disturbing detail was the expression on the park ranger's face. Not fear, but a frozen surprise, almost a peaceful resignation. It suggested no struggle, no last-ditch fight. Lawrence, a man who had seen the raw, primal fear of death on countless faces, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was not the work of a frenzied beast. Further on, he discovered more. a second park ranger hanging upside down from a tree, suspended by what looked like thick, fibrous cords like roots tightly wrapped around his ankles. The body was entirely intact, with no external wounds, only the telltale bluish pallor of suffocation. Another park ranger lay splayed in an open clearing, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the sky. His uniform was neatly folded beside him, and his sidearm placed carefully on top of it. He was unharmed, his chest devoid of any puncture wounds, but his heart had simply stopped. These were not the random, brutal killings of a wild animal. This was a deliberate, almost ritualistic display of power. Lawrence moved to the animal remains. The elk he had found earlier was just the beginning. He found deer, bears, even a cougar, all killed with the same unnatural precision. Some were drained of blood, others had bones neatly fractured without external damage to the flesh, as if their skeletons had been rearranged from the inside out. The usual signs of struggle, torn earth, broken branches, fur caught on thorns, were conspicuously absent. A typical predator, even a rabid one, left a chaotic scene, a furious struggle for survival. This was surgical. This was planned. His mind, accustomed to dissecting combat scenarios, pieced together the fragments. The lack of struggle, the specific and varied methods of death, the deliberate placement of bodies or items. It was not just dangerous. It was intelligent. The adversary acted not on instinct or mindless rage. It was calculating, observing, learning. It was a hunter, yes, but one that approached its prey with the cold, deliberate strategy of a human assassin. He felt less like he tracked an animal and more like he pursued a particularly twisted serial killer. Then came the tracks. Lawrence found them near the last park ranger's body, pressed into the damp earth beside the creek. They were anomalous, unlike anything he had ever seen. At first glance, they looked vaguely canine, large and powerful, but the toes were elongated, almost like fingers, and the claw marks were unusually deep, as if the creature possessed immense weight or exerted incredible pressure. But their variability was the most disturbing aspect. Some prints appeared almost bipedal, a single elongated footpad with distinct toes. Others shifted, morphing into a more traditional quadrupedal paw print, and in some places only a series of deep, thin gouges in the dirt, as if something with razor-sharp talons had simply dragged itself along. A shiver ran down Lawrence's spine. The creature changed its very form, or its method of locomotion, at will. It defied biological classification. As the afternoon wore on, a new, unsettling sensation began to prickle at the back of Lawrence's mind. It was not the usual hunter's instinct, the quiet awareness of prey or predator in the vicinity. This was a profound, chilling sense of being watched, not merely observed, but evaluated. Every step he took, every action, felt scrutinized as if the forest itself had eyes. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, his behavior recorded and analyzed by an unseen entity. The sensation was so pervasive, so visceral, that he found himself stopping often, turning his head sharply, sweeping the dense undergrowth with his rifle, but always finding nothing. Just the chilling silence. The first night in the Salmon Chalet sector brought no respite. Lawrence tried to sleep, wrapped tightly in his sleeping bag, but his senses were too heightened. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig, magnified and distorted. His own heartbeat thrummed in his ears. The familiar comfort of the forest, which had once offered him solace and a sense of belonging, transformed into a source of deep, primal anxiety. He was not just in the wild. He was in a cage, and the bars were made of silence and unseen eyes. He lay awake, staring at the dimly lit canvas of his tent, the weight of the forest pressing down on him, a hunter trapped in a hunting ground, slowly realizing he was the one being hunted. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of pursuit and evasion. Lawrence pressed deeper into the salmon chalice sector, but the creature was not simply moving, it was leading him. Its tracks, when he found them, directed him through treacherous ravines, across swift-flowing rivers, and into dense thickets where the undergrowth snagged at his clothing and tore at his skin. These routes were not random. They were chosen to maximize his vulnerability, to force him to expose himself, or to funnel him into locations where his movement would be restricted. It was a deliberate herding, a predator guiding its prey to the slaughter. Lawrence, ever the analyst, spent his waking hours dissecting the creature's tactics. It never attacked head-on. It never rushed him. Instead, it moved with an unnerving foresight, circumventing his carefully laid ambushes, seemingly anticipating his every move. He had set up tripwires across a narrow game trail only to find the creature's tracks skirting the perimeter, as if it had known their precise location. He had concealed himself in a high vantage point, rifle aimed at a choke point, only for the creature to bypass it entirely, its approach silent, its exit unseen. The beast read his thoughts, dissecting his strategies before he even fully committed to them. The frustration was a slow burn, turning his methodical mind into a crucible of simmering rage. He also noticed a chilling pattern in the creature's behavior. It did not kill everyone it encountered. He found discarded hunting blinds, their occupants long gone, but without the telltale signs of a struggle. Sometimes he discovered a recent campsite, hastily abandoned with gear still strewn about. The park ranger who had left his uniform neatly folded by his sidearm, the one whose heart simply stopped. These were not isolated incidents. The creature observed. It tested. It gauged its target's reactions to its presence, their fear, their resilience, before deciding their fate. This was not merely a hunt. It was a psychological experiment with Lawrence as the primary subject. The creature's manipulation of the environment was insidious. Sudden, unnatural rustles in the dead of night, too loud for a squirrel, too precise for the wind. The fleeting shadows danced at the periphery of his vision, coalescing into vaguely humanoid shapes before melting back into the trees. The light filtered through the dense canopy, creating optical illusions, making a gnarled root appear as a crouching form, a distant rock as a waiting menace. Lawrence found himself flinching at every sound, every shift in the light, his mind struggling to differentiate reality from the elaborate stage setting of his tormentor. In a desperate attempt to gain some control, Lawrence tried to establish a form of contact. He left small, distinct markers along his path. A perfectly stacked cairn of stones in a clearing, a stylized arrow drawn in the dirt with a stick. He was unsure what he expected. A response in kind? A sign of recognition? But the answers he received only amplified his terror. He found his cairn meticulously disassembled, its stones restacked into an incomprehensible geometric pattern that defied natural formation. His drawn arrow was erased, replaced by a single deep claw mark in the earth, too precise to be random. The creature understood his attempts at communication and answered him with mockery, with a chilling display of its own alien intellect. Days bled into nights without the comfort of proper rest. Lawrence could not afford to sleep deeply, every nerve ending on high alert. The constant tension, the relentless psychological pressure, began to take its toll. His movements, once fluid and precise, became sluggish. His concentration wavered. He found himself blinking slowly, his eyelids heavy, his vision blurring at the edges. The paranoia, once a background hum, now throbbed like a raw nerve. He experienced vivid, unsettling hallucinations, the trees twisting into gnarled faces, the wind whispering his name, the shadows coalescing into fleeting figures just out of sight. His carefully constructed mental defenses, built over years of trauma and discipline, began to fray at the edges. It was during one such waking dream, as he stumbled through a particularly dense thicket, that the horrifying realization solidified. He had always been the hunter, the apex predator, the one who stalked and killed. But here, in this silent, malevolent forest, the roles were reversed. He was not hunting the beast hunted him. And it did not hunt him for a kill. It hunted him to study him, his reactions, his instincts, his training, his very will to survive. All of it meticulously observed, analyzed, and catalogued. This was not a game of life and death. It was a horrifying dissection of his mind, and he was the unwilling specimen. The knowledge curdled in his gut, a cold, existential dread that went deeper than any fear of physical harm. He was a puzzle being solved, and the solution promised to be utterly terrifying. The breach was not violent, which made it all the more unsettling. Lawrence returned to his camp under the cloak of a moonless night, the scent of damp earth and pine needles filling the air. He felt the shift immediately. Not a broken tripwire, not a disturbed branch, just a subtle wrongness in the air, a faint scent that was not his own. His camp, his sanctuary, his last bastion of control in this maddening forest, had been violated. He drew his rifle, sweeping the perimeter slowly, his heart a cold knot in his chest. His traps, laid with meticulous precision, were undisturbed. No snapped branches, no telltale scuff marks in the soft earth. The entry had been utterly silent, perfectly executed. It was a feat of stealth that stunned him, a man who prided himself on his ability to move unseen. Then he saw it. His combat knife, a custom-forged blade he had carried since his United States Army Ranger days, was not in its sheath where he had left it. It was sunk hilt deep into the trunk of a towering pine directly beside his tent. The polished steel glinted faintly in the low light, a silent, blatant declaration. This was not a casual disturbance. This was a message, not an act of vandalism, but a demonstration of strength, a chilling display of the creature's ability to penetrate his defenses, and a sneering contempt for his vaunted skills. It had been inside his space, intimately close, and he had not known. Attached to the handle of the knife, skewered by the tip, was a small, ragged piece of hide. Lawrence used the light from his headlamp to examine it. It was black, dense and oddly stiff, with a texture unlike any animal fur he knew. It did not have the coarse bristles of a bear or the soft undercoat of a wolf. It felt leathery, almost reptilian, yet it was clearly fur. A patch of it. The realization struck him like a physical blow. This was not just a piece of an animal. This was the hide of the werewolf, torn from its own body, presented to him as a trophy. He understood instantly. This was not an accidental encounter. nor was it merely a threat. This was a personal challenge, an explicit declaration of war. The creature was not just hunting him. It played with him, taunting him, testing his reactions like a sadistic scientist. The knife was a symbol of his identity, the hide a piece of its own. It was a direct, intimate, and terrifying invitation to a duel. The revelation ignited something primal within Lawrence. His usual methodical approach, his detached analysis, shattered. A cold, uncontrolled fury surged through him, mixing with a deep, visceral fear he had not felt since that night in the rubble. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to rend the trees with his bare hands. But years of discipline held him, just barely, on the precipice of madness. This was not just a job anymore. This was personal. He changed his tactics, his movements driven by this raw, new energy. He packed everything, leaving nothing behind for the creature to desecrate again. His camp was no more. He moved constantly, a phantom in the forest, denying the creature any fixed point to target. He became not just a hunter, but also the bait, a living, breathing lure for a monster that craved interaction. He became as unpredictable as the creature itself. He also started looking for hidden meanings in the creature's actions. Why the knife? Why the hide? Why now? He tried to enter the mind of this intellectual predator, searching for its motivations, its patterns of thought. It was like playing chess against an invisible grandmaster, each move a calculated risk, each counter-move a terrifying revelation. He saw the forest through new eyes, not just as a hunting ground, but as a chessboard where he was a pawn, but a pawn that now understood the rules of the game, or at least tried to. For the first time since he had left the army, Lawrence felt a profound, almost incapacitating loss of control. The carefully constructed walls around his emotions crumbled. The stoic detachment he had cultivated was ripped away, exposing the raw, wounded man beneath. The rage pulsed through him, hot and blinding, driving him forward, and the fear whispered its insidious poison. He was on the edge, a hair's breadth from snapping. But paradoxically, this wild, untamed fury also gave him strength. He was not just surviving, he fought, truly fighting, for the first time in years. And in this madness he felt a terrifying clarity. He would either kill this thing or it would break him entirely. The new tactical approach offered no real respite. Lawrence, now a wandering shadow, constantly checked his back, his senses hyper-alert. The creature was still there, always a step ahead, always confirming its horrifying intelligence. He found his carefully placed traps, designed to snare or disable even the largest game, neutralized. Not broken, not tripped, not even damaged. Simply disarmed. A spring released, a mechanism subtly jammed, a tripwire meticulously unhooked and relayed, all without a single scuff mark in the damp earth. The forest itself had simply sighed, and the traps had deactivated. The precision was chilling, proving that the adversary understood the mechanics, the engineering, the very intent behind Lawrence's actions. Then the radio started. His handheld receiver, tuned to an emergency channel and usually silent save for the occasional burst of static from a distant weather station, began to emit strange, rhythmic sounds. At first, he dismissed it as a dying battery or sunspot interference. Just random crackle and hiss. But as he listened, huddled under a thick stand of firs, he discerned a pattern. Not music, not Morse code, but a distinct, pulsating rhythm, a series of clicks and low thrums that ebbed and flowed with a deliberate, unsettling cadence. It was a language, he realized with a jolt, but not one he recognized. He held the receiver closer to his ear, straining to make sense of the noise. And then, within the chaotic symphony of static, he heard it. A sound, low and guttural, that morphed into something unmistakably human. A voice? It was distorted, as if filtered through 1,000 feet of earth, a whisper from the very depths of the forest. It was deep, resonant, ancient, yet undeniably speaking in a human register. Lawrence froze, every muscle tensed. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to clear his head, but the sound persisted, a haunting echo of sanity in a world that rapidly lost its grip. And then, it whispered his name. Lawrence. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling static, but utterly clear. His name. Not a garbled sound, not a coincidence. A direct, personal address. The sound burrowed into his mind, bypassing his logical defenses, striking a raw nerve. It was not just a voice. It was his voice, spoken by something inhuman. The boundary between reality and hallucination, already thin, snapped with a chilling finality. He was not just being hunted. He was being spoken to. And his tormentor knew his name. Lawrence spent the next several hours in a frantic, desperate attempt to identify the source of the signal. He moved through the dense forest, Global Positioning System unit in hand, trying to triangulate the signal, turning his antenna, adjusting the frequency. But it was useless. The signal remained elusive, a ubiquitous phantom. It emanated from everywhere and nowhere at once, a pervasive echo that filled the air around him. He ran, stumbled, cursed, pushing his equipment to its limits, but the voice remained untraceable. A phantom in the machine. The psychological impact was devastating. Lawrence had faced down enemy fire, endured torture, survived explosions that vaporized men around him. He endured physical pain. But this was different. This was an attack on his sanity, a methodical erosion of his grip on reality. He started questioning everything. Was he hallucinating? Had the isolation finally broken him? The forest, once a comfort, became a vast, living nightmare designed to unravel his mind. Every rustle, every shadow, now carried the terrifying possibility of the voice, of his name being whispered from the depths of the void. Each incident, the disarmed traps, the omnipresent voice, cemented a terrifying conclusion. His adversary was not just an animal. It was not just an intelligent creature. It was something far more complex, far more malicious. It was capable of not only physical threat, but also sophisticated psychological warfare. A master of manipulating both the environment and his mind. This was no longer a hunting assignment. This was a battle for his very sanity, and the enemy played for keeps. Desperation, a cold, hard knot in his gut, forced Lawrence to change tactics again. His rifle and knife, his traditional tools of survival, felt inadequate against an enemy that spoke through radios and disarmed traps by unseen means. He needed proof, something tangible, something he processed with his logical, pragmatic mind. He needed to see it. From his pack, Lawrence pulled out the compact, high-resolution cameras he rarely used, reserved for documenting particularly obscure anomalies. He had 5 of them, each equipped with military-grade night vision, motion sensors, and a silent, high-capacity solid-state drive. He moved with renewed purpose, scaling trees, wedging them into rock crevices, burying them in dense undergrowth. He set them in strategic points around the area where he felt the presence most keenly, around water sources, game trails, and the perimeter of his shifting temporary camps. He would deny the creature the luxury of remaining unseen. The waiting was agonizing. Days bled into nights, Lawrence poring over countless hours of empty footage. The cameras recorded only the wind rustling through the leaves, the scurry of unseen mice, the occasional owl hunting in the darkness. The frustration mounted, a bitter taste in his mouth. The creature was always a step ahead, always aware, always observing. He tried to catch a phantom on film, and the elusive entity delighted in his futility. He was a man with a system, encountering a variable that refused to be categorized. Then, on the fourth night, after setting the cameras, one of the motion sensors triggered. Lawrence, huddled in a makeshift shelter of branches and pine needles, watched the small monitor flicker to life. At first it was just a deeper shade of darkness, a fleeting shadow moving across the frame. Then, the night vision resolved it. A figure. It was bipedal, standing upright like a man, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs were too long, too slender, yet powerfully muscled. Its head was small, tucked low, and its body was covered in the black matted hide he had found attached to his knife. It moved with an unnatural grace, a fluid, silent motion that defied physics. It was inhuman, undeniably monstrous, yet there was something disturbingly familiar about its posture, its gait, the way it shifted its weight. A primal part of Lawrence's brain screamed predator, but a more rational part whispered human. The figure, moving with a predator's calculated patience, suddenly stopped. It stood motionless, perfectly still, directly in the center of the frame. It did not flinch, did not turn its head. It simply stopped, its bizarre dark form silhouetted against the pale green glow of the night vision. Lawrence's breath hitched. It knew the camera was there. Despite the meticulous concealment, despite the lack of visible light or sound, it had sensed the lens, the silent electronic eye watching it. Slowly, deliberately, the creature began to move again. Not away from the camera, but towards it. Its movements were unnervingly precise, each step an act of conscious will. It did not rush, did not hesitate. It approached the tiny hidden lens as if drawn by an invisible thread. Lawrence watched, paralyzed, as the black, hulking shape filled the frame, growing larger and larger until its face, if it could be called a face, was mere inches from the camera. And then it smiled. It was no human smile. There was no warmth, no joy, no recognition in it. It was a rictus, a bearing of impossibly sharp, needle-like teeth in a wide, lipless grin. Its eyes, deep-set and glowing with an eerie, predatory light, pierced through the lens, through the monitor, and directly into Lawrence's soul. The smile was full of a chilling, conscious malevolence, a perverse satisfaction, and an undeniable intelligence. It knew it was being watched, and it reveled in it. It was not just a creature, it was a performer, and Lawrence was its captive audience. This single, terrifying image overturned everything Lawrence thought he knew, leaving him gasping for air, teetering on the precipice of despair. The hunt was no longer a hunt. It had been reversed. This creature was not just a target, it was an examiner. He was not the hunter. He was the prey, and his reactions, his habits, his tactical decisions, everything about him was meticulously observed and recorded. Not by a hidden camera, but by the keen, malevolent mind of the monster itself. The smile confirmed it. It studied him, and now it was ready for the next phase of its game. The smile from the darkness had shattered Lawrence's last vestiges of control, transforming the hunt into a perverse, intensified pursuit. The creature now revealed did not just stalk him. It led him deeper into the labyrinthine heart of the Salmon Chalice sector. It was a dance of predator and prey, but the predator held the leash, guiding Lawrence with a terrifying precision, exploiting his deteriorating physical and psychological state. The werewolf was a master of manipulation. It left breadcrumbs for Lawrence to follow, not just tracks, but deliberate, calculated lures. He found strange symbols carved into the bark of ancient trees, geometric patterns that shifted and writhed in his peripheral vision. There were small, circular clearings where branches had been meticulously arranged into swirling, intricate designs, almost like ancient pictographs. He found subtle alterations in the environment. A patch of wildflowers purposefully crushed to form a single, arrow-like indentation in the soil. A stream dammed with perfectly placed stones to create an unnatural pooling of water. Lawrence, the consummate park ranger, could not ignore them. His training demanded he read the signs, and these signs screamed of intelligence, of purpose. Each breadcrumb was a whisper, a silent invitation, drawing him deeper into the creature's web. The forest itself became a living trap, a maze of illusions crafted by the creature's subtle hand. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig magnified, distorted, made to sound like a deliberate movement just out of sight. Shadows stretched and contracted, turning into fleeting monstrous shapes that danced at the edges of his vision. The creature played with his perception, twisting his own senses against him, amplifying the paranoia that had simmered beneath the surface. Lawrence found himself flinching at nothing, spinning to face empty air, his rifle sweeping barren clearings. He was trapped in a hallucination orchestrated by his tormentor. The relentless pursuit, the constant psychological terror, and the profound lack of sleep pushed Lawrence to the precipice of physical and mental collapse. Days and nights merged into an indistinguishable blur. His muscles ached with a dull, constant throb, his joints stiff and protesting. His movements, once fluid and precise, became clumsy, stumbling. He lost all sense of time and direction, navigating by instinct alone, his internal compass spinning wildly. The meager rations he had left barely sustained him, and the biting cold that permeated the forest leached the very warmth from his bones. A profound despair settled over him, heavy and suffocating. All his skills, honed by years of combat and wilderness survival, felt utterly useless against this opponent. The creature did not fight by human rules or even by animal rules. It played its own game, a game Lawrence barely comprehended, and it knew him better than he knew himself. His training, his experience, his very humanity were systematically dismantled. The hopelessness was a bitter pill, dissolving his resolve, leaving him hollow. The hallucinations, once fleeting glimpses, now became more persistent, more vivid. The trees sprouted grotesque faces, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers. Voices whispered his name on the wind, sometimes the familiar chilling rasp from the radio, sometimes the voices of his dead teammates, mocking him, urging him deeper. He saw figures darting between the trees, always just out of focus, always vanishing when he tried to fix them with his gaze. He stumbled, disoriented, losing his sense of balance, his body betraying him at the most critical time. Yet, despite the terror, despite the encroaching madness, Lawrence felt a strange, compelling pull. He knew with an icy certainty that he was being led somewhere. The creature's breadcrumbs, its psychological games, its relentless herding, it was all for a purpose. He approached the climax, the heart of the labyrinth, where all these questions would finally be answered. He was dragged to the place where everything was meant to end. A perverse curiosity, a desperate need to understand what this creature was, what it wanted, what was truly happening in this damned forest, drove him forward. He was on a leash, yes, but he walked it willingly, drawn by the irresistible gravity of the final revelation. The creature's breadcrumbs led Lawrence through a final, winding path, up a steep, pine-covered incline, before depositing him at the edge of a small, overgrown clearing. There, tucked away amongst ancient moss-draped cedars, stood an old hunting lodge. It was a single-story structure, built of rough-hewn timber and fieldstone, its windows boarded up, its porch sagging, its roof partially collapsed. It looked as though it had been abandoned since the 1960s, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Despite its decay, an eerie stillness hung about it, a sense of patient waiting as if it had expected him. Lawrence approached cautiously, his rifle held ready, scanning the dense woods around the lodge. The silence here differed from the pervasive quiet of the deeper forest. It felt heavy with forgotten secrets, with the weight of human despair. A profound sense of premonition settled over him. He knew with absolute certainty that the answers he sought were within these decaying walls. The creature had brought him here for a reason. He forced open the main door, which hung precariously on a single rusty hinge, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood, mildew, and something else, a faint metallic tang that raised the hairs on his arms. The interior was dark, dust-choked, and littered with debris. He flicked on his headlamp, its beam cutting through the gloom, revealing overturned furniture, scattered papers, and the gnawed remains of what looked like old food wrappers. Among the rubble, tucked into a moldering desk drawer, Lawrence found the first clues. Documents, pages yellowed with age, brittle to the touch, and many of them shredded, torn, or partially burned. He gathered them with painstaking care, his park ranger's instinct for evidence overriding his growing dread. He spread them on a relatively clean patch of floor, trying to piece them together like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. They were old reports, filled with official-sounding jargon, but the content was chillingly familiar. Anomalous animal sightings, aggressive species unknown, containment protocols. The agency had been here before. Decades ago. Beneath the shredded reports, he discovered something even more disturbing. Handwritten journals, thick leather-bound books, their pages warped by moisture. They were personal logbooks, written in a variety of hands, some neat and precise, others scrawled in a frantic, desperate scribble. The entries were disjointed, rambling, but filled with horrifying details of strange occurrences in the forest, reports of the same pervasive silence, the same sense of being watched, the same impossible tracks. The dates stretched back to the 1960s and 70s. These were the records of the men who had been sent before him. Then he saw the walls. Scrawled across the peeling wallpaper, etched into the rough-hewn timbers, were crude, desperate messages. Not with paint or ink, but with something dark and rust-colored. blood. "Don't trust them," one read, smeared and barely legible. Another screamed, "It changes you." Near the fireplace, a tally mark, long and precise, followed by a single chilling name: Talus. These were not just warnings. They were the desperate final testament of men driven to madness and despair, their final act a frantic attempt to communicate the truth of their torment. Lawrence knelt, piecing together fragments from the reports and the logbooks, a cold dread seeping into his very soul. The names he recognized, scattered through the documents, appeared again on the blood-scrawled walls. Subject Row 7, Contractor Echo 2. Each entry, each fragmented report, recounted a similar mission: the elimination of an aggressive, unknown species. Each ended abruptly, without resolution, simply ceasing to be. He found mentions of teams of 2, sometimes 3, sent in at regular intervals over the decades. He counted the names, cross-referencing them where possible. 12. 12 other hunters sent into this forest on the same mission, and none of them had returned. The most horrific truth, however, was not that they had died, but that no one had come looking for them. There were no official reports of their disappearance, no search and rescue operations, no debriefings detailing their failure. The project was not about elimination at all. It was an ongoing experiment, a test. Lawrence stared at the blood-smeared names on the wall, the chilling tally marks, the desperate warnings, and the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was not the hunter. He was merely the 13th subject, a pawn in a game he had not even known he was playing. The magnitude of the government's deception hit Lawrence with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping in the dust-choked air of the lodge. He was not a hunter. He was a lab rat. He was not eliminating a threat. He was being tested by one. The shock turned quickly to a blinding, bitter rage. All his life he had served, he had followed orders. He had been a tool in the hands of others. But he had always believed in the inherent, albeit often flawed, morality of his superiors. Now, that belief shattered, leaving behind only the jagged shards of betrayal. His anger was a living thing, churning in his gut, demanding an outlet. His understanding of the werewolf, the creature that had tormented him, shifted dramatically. It was not just a monster. It was an examiner, a guardian of this twisted test. Its actions, once terrifyingly random, now fell into a horrifying pattern of purpose. The mind games, the precise killings, the deliberate psychological attacks. It was not chaotic evil. It was a methodical, cruel evaluation. The creature was not just a hunter. It had a role, a terrifying function within this long-running experiment. Lawrence's mind, despite the exhaustion and emotional turmoil, began to race, frantically searching for an exit. He had to understand the rules of this new game, the true objective, if he was to have any hope of survival. Physical force was clearly useless. 12 others, trained soldiers like himself, had failed. They had faced the beast, and they had disappeared, their only legacy the blood-scrawled warnings on these walls. He needed a different approach, an unconventional path to victory, or, at the very least, to escape. But what was the escape, when the whole point of the project was to keep him here? Memories of his own military past, of missions where he had been a disposable asset, a piece on a chessboard, flooded his mind. He remembered the cold calculations of strategists, the way lives were weighed against objectives, the way men became statistics. The pain of those memories, long suppressed, intensified now, searing through him with the bitter realization that history repeated itself. Only this time, he was the primary statistic. He had escaped one labyrinth of human deception only to be ensnared in another, deeper one. The physical conditions became unbearable. The temperature in the lodge, even within its decaying walls, plummeted as night fell, the cold seeping through his thick clothing, chilling him to the bone. His stomach cramped with hunger, a gnawing, constant ache that sapped his remaining strength. The nervous tension, the constant high alert, drained the last vestiges of his endurance. Every joint screamed in protest, every muscle throbbed, and his mind, though clearer now about the project, felt like a strained spring about to snap. He knew with a certainty that transcended logic that the final confrontation was imminent. The creature had led him here to this place of answers for a reason. This lodge was not just a historical archive. It was a stage. Every psychological torture, every physical trial had been a prelude. This was the final act, and he was the unwilling star. The question was, what was the climax? Death? Escape? Or something far more insidious? Lawrence stared at the bloodied names, the tally marks of the fallen. What was the true purpose of this test? Was it simply a measure of survival, a twisted form of natural selection? Or was it something deeper, something about the qualities of the subject? And what happened to those who failed? The warnings on the wall, "It changes you," echoed in his mind. He was not just fighting for his life. He was fighting for his very essence, for his humanity, against an adversary that was intent on reshaping him into something else entirely. The stakes had never been higher. Lawrence gathered what little strength remained, the rage and fear now coalescing into a cold, hard resolve. The final battle was inevitable. The air in the decaying lodge crackled with its imminence. He checked the last few rounds in his rifle's magazine, the click of the bolt a lonely sound in the oppressive silence. He ran his thumb along the sharpened edge of his combat knife, the steel a familiar comfort against his skin. But he knew with chilling certainty that these weapons were almost useless. They were made for flesh and bone, for a world of predictable physical laws. His enemy defied those laws. The werewolf appeared shortly after, a dark, hulking presence outside the lodge's shattered windows. It did not burst through the door, did not attack. Instead, it moved with a predatory grace, circling the dilapidated structure, its movements silent, fluid. It began to emit strange sounds, a low, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the very foundations of the lodge, a hypnotic pulse that burrowed into Lawrence's mind. It was a pressure, not physical, but psychological, designed to shatter his resolve, to push him further into the depths of despair. Lawrence retreated to the center of the main room, his back against the stone fireplace, his rifle held ready. He fought an internal battle, a raging monologue against the fears and doubts that clawed at the edges of his sanity. He thought of his principles, the code he had lived by as a United States Army Ranger, the belief in humanity he had clung to even after the horrors he had witnessed. Survival at all costs, his training whispered. But what if the cost was himself? What if survival meant becoming something less than human? The warnings on the wall screamed at him. It changes you. He remembered the park ranger with the folded uniform, the one whose heart simply stopped. He remembered the bodies drained of blood, the bones rearranged. Death, he realized, was not the worst outcome. Death would be a release, an end to the torment. But to become part of this forest, to be transformed into one of these things, to be an instrument of this cruel, unending test, to hunt others as he had been hunted, that was the true horror. That was the ultimate failure. The werewolf stopped circling. It let out a low, guttural growl, then began to pace, slowly, deliberately, towards the main entrance. It was not attacking. It lured him, drawing him out, or perhaps drawing him into a specific, predetermined space within the lodge itself. Lawrence felt the pull, the subtle, unseen force guiding him. He took a single, deliberate step towards the door, then another, his eyes fixed on the entrance, his heart pounding in his ears. This was the maneuver, the final act of the creature's sinister play. The atmosphere in the lodge became unbearable, charged with an almost tangible electricity. Every creak of the aging timbers, every whisper of the wind through the broken windows, every sliver of moonlight piercing the gloom, hummed with the tension of imminent collision. His senses were overloaded, his body trembling with exhaustion and anticipation. He tasted the metallic tang of fear in his mouth, felt the cold sweat trickling down his spine. Then, from the darkness of the entrance, the werewolf appeared. It did not leap, did not charge. It simply stepped into the faint light, slowly, deliberately, until it stood directly before Lawrence, a hulking, black silhouette framed against the paler night. Its eyes, glowing with that same predatory, intelligent light, fixed on him. It was not a sudden ambush, but a horrifying, intended, face-to-face confrontation, the culmination of everything. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with an ancient, primal challenge. Lawrence raised his rifle, its barrel trembling slightly, and stared into the eyes of his tormentor, ready for whatever twisted fate awaited him. The werewolf stood before Lawrence, barely 10 feet separating them, a hulking mass of shadow and sinew. Lawrence's finger tightened on the trigger, but his mind, against all instinct, screamed wait. The creature did not move. It did not attack. The moment stretched, a profound, agonizing silence broken only by the ragged sound of Lawrence's own breath. The tension was a physical force pressing down on him, coiling tighter with each passing second. Then the creature moved, not to attack, but to shed. Slowly, deliberately, it began to peel away layers from its body, not fur, but something like clothing. From its left arm, it pulled away a ragged piece of torn fabric, a familiar dull green, the remains of a United States Army Ranger uniform. It dropped to the floor with a soft thud. From its chest, a tattered piece of leather, mottled and dark, with a faint, tarnished metal badge still affixed to it, a Federal Wildlife Service insignia. And from its grotesque, matted head, something else fell, a piece of something that looked like dried, dark flesh, which clattered to the floor like bone chips. Lawrence stared, horrified, as the creature systematically stripped itself of these gruesome trophies, revealing glimpses of what lay beneath. In its methodical movements, he saw an unnerving familiarity, a precision that was distinctly human. Beneath the matted hide, the structure of its limbs, the way its shoulder muscles flexed, hinted at a bipedal form, disturbingly similar to his own. It was like watching a man peel off a meticulously crafted monster suit, though the suit was made of agony and the remains of its victims. Then from the creature's throat, a low, guttural rumble began. It was not the hypnotic thrumming from earlier, but something new. something that fought for articulation. The sounds were rough, grating as if unused for centuries, yet they slowly, agonizingly began to form words. The voice was deep, resonant, ancient, layered with the echoes of the forest itself, like a whisper carried on an old, forgotten wind. But it was clear, and it was human. "Lawrence Kane," the voice rumbled, the syllables scraping like stone. "You have proven resilient." Lawrence's rifle clattered to the floor, forgotten. He stared, wide-eyed, as the creature took another step, its form less monstrous now, more defined. "My name," the voice continued, "is Jacob Tallis." The name echoed in Lawrence's mind, searing through the haze of shock and exhaustion. Jacob Tallis. The name on the blood-scrawled wall. The first hunter, sent in decades ago. He was not dead. He was here. He was this. Jacob Tallis extended a hand, its fingers long and powerful, tipped with blunt, dark nails, but distinctly human underneath the rough, dark skin. "They sent me first, Lawrence. Decades ago. They thought I would eliminate the anomaly. They were wrong," he explained, his voice growing stronger with each word, though still resonant with the deep thrum of the forest. "I did not die, Lawrence. I survived. And in surviving, I learned. This forest, it has an ancient mind, a consciousness. It changes things, not to destroy them, but to adapt them, to make them part of itself. I fought it as you fought it. I tried to apply their rules, their systems, their military logic." He gestured to the uniform scraps on the floor. "But the forest's logic is older, deeper." He paused, his eyes, still glowing with that intelligent, inhuman light, fixed on Lawrence. "I did not just survive, Lawrence. I assimilated. I understood. My purpose here is not to kill those they send. It is to offer them a choice. To see if they can understand, as I did, to see if they can adapt." Lawrence looked into Jacob's eyes, and in their depths, he saw not a monster, but a profound, ancient understanding. Jacob was not a predator in the conventional sense. He was a sentinel, a gatekeeper, a living embodiment of the forest's will. The true project, Lawrence realized with a chilling clarity that resonated through every fiber of his being, was not about killing cryptids. It was about creating them. It was about creating new beings, adapted to this primal, ancient intelligence of the forest, capable of living within it, on par with its hidden, powerful forces. He was not meant to destroy the anomaly. He was meant to become it. And now Jacob Tallis, the first, offered him the ultimate choice: death, or a new, terrifying existence. The choice, presented not as a threat, but as an inevitability, hung in the air between Lawrence and Jacob. Death, or transformation, humanity or adaptation. Lawrence looked into Jacob's eyes, saw the ancient intelligence, the profound understanding of a world beyond human comprehension. He thought of the rage, the betrayal, the futile struggle against a system he could not defeat. He thought of the specters of his past, the screams in the rubble, the men he could not save. He had sought the wilderness for silence, for an escape from the weight of his humanity. And here it was, the ultimate escape. A new purpose, perhaps, a new form. His decision was not one of surrender, but of a cold, pragmatic acceptance. He had come to kill a monster, but the real monster was the organization that sent him. And the true power lay not in resistance, but in understanding, in becoming part of the system that had sought to break him. He would adapt. He would survive. But not as Lawrence Kane, the broken United States Army Ranger, as something new. Weeks passed in the Salmon Chali sector, weeks that blurred into a primal haze of transition, of learning the forest's ancient rhythms through a new, evolving consciousness. Lawrence learned to navigate the whispering currents of the forest's mind, to interpret the unseen patterns of life and death, to move as silently as the shadows themselves. Then, one crisp morning, a short, laconic message arrived at the secure, encrypted terminal deep within the sterile headquarters of the Federal Wildlife Service. It bypassed most of the usual encryption protocols, direct and unburdened by standard agency communication. Target eliminated. Sector cleared. Returning to base. K. The operations officer, a man named Sterling with an unnervingly smooth demeanor, raised an eyebrow. The message was concise, efficient, exactly what they expected from Lawrence Kane. He cross-referenced the signature. It matched the biometric data they had on file for Kane. All parameters met. Another successful adaptation. The Salmon Chalice sector, a long-running critical testing ground, was ready for its next phase. Sterling simply nodded, a faint, imperceptible smile touching his lips. A few days later, a surveillance camera at the remote security checkpoint on the edge of the Clearwater National Forest registered a figure emerging from the dense woods. It was Lawrence Kane. He strode confidently, effortlessly, towards the small, unmanned booth. But he was different. Taller now, by at least a head, his frame broader, more substantial, as if his bones had stretched and thickened. His gait was unnatural, no longer the precise, compact movements of a United States Army Ranger, but a fluid, predatory lope, with a subtle, low-slung grace that hinted at immense power held in check. He moved with a slight, almost imperceptible stoop, as if the ancient weight of the forest now rested upon his shoulders. His face had changed too, subtly but profoundly. The familiar lines of fatigue were gone, replaced by sharper, more defined angles. His cheekbones were more prominent, his jawline harder. His eyes, once deep-set but clearly human, now receded further into their sockets, their color an unusual, striking shade of gold-flecked green that shimmered with an unsettling luminescence. His skin, once a healthy, sun-weathered tan, had taken on an unusual earthy tone, a blend of deep olive and muted gray. But it was truly the eyes that held the most chilling revelation. They were not the eyes of Lawrence Kane, the broken United States Army Ranger. They were the eyes of something else entirely. Something ancient, something knowing, something that had absorbed the primal wisdom of the forest, something with an inhuman glint of predatory intelligence. He had returned, irrevocably changed, having become a part of the very world he had been sent to hunt. Lawrence Kane was the living, breathing, terrifying proof of Project Adaptation's success. He walked past the checkpoint, and the forest, silent no more, walked with him.